Have you ever kept a journal? And did anyone ever read it without your permission?
Thanksgiving has always been a strange performance in my family, a mix of forced gratitude and barely concealed judgment, with everyone pretending the meal itself could hold together cracks that had been growing for decades. That year, the turkey was dry, the candles leaned dangerously close to the napkins, and my mother's voice cut through the chatter with the kind of confidence only someone used to being obeyed could summon. She raised her glass of Chardonnay and smiled as if she were announcing a promotion at work instead of detonating a bomb in the middle of her own dining room. "Your sister deserves the house," she said, her words polished and rehearsed. "She's the responsible one." I didn't look at my sister immediately, because I knew the smirk waiting there, the rehearsed expression of the golden child who had been handed every blessing in life and still believed she had earned them. Instead, I turned to my mother, held her gaze just long enough to make the silence stretch, and let a slow smile rise across my face. "Funny," I said, drawing out the word as if it were a toast of my own. "Since I'm the only one paying property taxes." The room froze in a way I had never seen before, not even during the ugliest arguments of my childhood. My mother's fork slipped from her hand and hit the porcelain plate with a sharp, metallic clink that seemed to echo. My father cleared his throat as though buying time. My aunt stared at her wine glass like it might reveal the lottery numbers, and my cousin reached for another roll as if bread could save him from the moment. Emily, my perfect sister, shifted in her chair with an awkward laugh, the kind you release when you want people to think the joke is on someone else. "She's kidding," she said quickly, her eyes darting toward our parents for backup. But I wasn't kidding, and for the first time in years, they could all see it. It was a strange thing, holding power at that table after being invisible for so long. Every holiday had been a parade of Emily's so-called accomplishments, stories inflated to the size of parables, while my contributions were brushed off with nods or, worse, silence. They didn't know about the mornings I had woken up in a cold sweat, calculating whether I could cover another round of bills before penalties kicked in. They didn't know about the nights I stayed late at work, just to make sure the mortgage didn't slip into default. They had no idea how many times I quietly saved the house they now spoke of as if it were a prize in a contest, already engraved with my sister's name. I hadn't planned on saying it that night, not in front of the extended family, not with pumpkin pie waiting to be sliced in the kitchen. But something in the way my mother smiled when she made that announcement, the smug certainty of it, snapped whatever thread of patience I had left. I wanted them to know, wanted them to feel the ground shift under their chairs, wanted them to taste the truth like bitter coffee when they had expected sweet wine. Emily leaned forward, her voice dripping with false calm. "You don't really mean that. You're exaggerating." I turned to her then, letting the weight of my stare pin her in place. "I have every receipt," I said softly, almost tenderly, as if I were confessing a secret rather than declaring war. "Every single one." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. My father's jaw worked like he wanted to speak, but couldn't find the right words. My mother busied herself with the napkin in her lap, folding and unfolding it as though fabric could distract from truth. Even my uncle, who usually filled gaps with bad jokes about football, seemed struck dumb. Emily's eyes flickered, and for the first time, the confidence she wore like a second skin cracked. I remembered every moment that had brought me here, the late notice I had intercepted from the county office, the sick feeling in my stomach when I realized the house could be seized, and the quiet rage when I understood that no one else cared enough to notice. I had signed the checks, logged into the portals, called the offices, and each time I swore I would tell them. But then I'd see Emily crying about her car payment, or my father nodding proudly at her flimsy new job, and I'd swallow the truth again, letting it fester. Not tonight. Tonight the truth had a seat at the table, and it wasn't planning on leaving early. "Receipts," my father finally managed, his voice hoarse, uncertain. "Yes," I said, leaning back in my chair, calm now in a way I hadn't felt in years. "Receipts for every dollar I've poured into the house you think she deserves. While you were too busy calling her responsible, I was the one keeping the roof from slipping out from under all of us." No one moved. No one breathed. And in that stillness, I realized something that both thrilled and terrified me. This was only the beginning. The hum of small talk tried to crawl back over the table like a weak tide, pretending it could erase footprints, yet the words I had already spoken kept sitting there between the gravy boat and the casserole as if they had been carved in the wood. And while my mother dabbed at a spot that did not exist on the tablecloth and my father worried the stem of his glass like it might break under his fingers, Emily leaned into that smooth posture she had practiced since high school, the one that made teachers and neighbors and uncles believe every pretty sentence that came out of her mouth, and said in a voice so reasonable it made my skin prickle that of course she was responsible, that of course she deserved the house. That of course I had misunderstood a pile of confusing bills because I always made a fuss about money as if it were a personality trait rather than a stubborn stack of obligations that never once paid themselves. I let her talk longer than I needed to, because I wanted the room to hear how easily she layered varnish over rotting wood, and because I wanted my parents to recognize the script they had coached into her for years. And when she finally paused for oxygen, I leaned forward, not to fight, not to shout, but to invite everyone into a little holiday game that I called, with as much politeness as I could squeeze into the syllables, a responsibility audit, which sounded dull enough to be safe and neutral enough to make my aunt keep smiling, and then I asked them to lift their placemats. Under each plate I had slipped a photocopy that was not dramatic by itself, a simple record with dates and amounts, and my name printed cleanly beside the words remitted and processed, and when the paper rasped against the cotton and everyone peeked, the room drew in a breath as one organism, because there were county tax receipts for spring and for late summer. There was the emergency plumber bill from the night the upstairs toilet bled through the ceiling. There were the homeowner's insurance declarations with my payments highlighted in the kind of cheerful yellow you buy for school supplies. There was an innocuous email printout confirming that the escrow shortfall had been cured not by a miracle, but by my debit card on a Tuesday morning at 9. And there was the cheery thank you from the county portal that never once landed in my parents' inbox, because those logins, like so many other tedious duties, had drifted into my hands the year my father mixed up due dates and my mother insisted it was all a misunderstanding that would sort itself out if we were patient and prayed. Emily laughed too loudly, the kind of laugh that tries to turn a courtroom into a sitcom, and said that the copies proved nothing of substance, because anyone could pay a bill as a favor, because family looks out for family. Because I had obviously made a choice to help and was now angling for applause, and I nodded as if I agreed that generosity was a near-religious calling while I slid my phone onto the table and tapped once to send a file I had named with an edge sharp enough to cut through. The last of the pretending, responsible one.pdf, which landed in the family group chat with a soft chime that rippled down the table as their devices lit up like slot machines. And inside that single document sat the entire year's paper trail arranged by month with neat annotations, including the text message from my father in early spring asking, in a voice stripped of his usual certainty, if I could cover this one, and he would make it square soon, including my mother's airy reply a week later, promising to circle back after the holidays, which never came, including the exchange where Emily asked me to hang on with the insurance premium because she was between accounts, including the county's warning about a late penalty that never hit because I paid during my lunch break and ate cold leftovers at my desk to make the timing work. My revenge in that moment was not fireworks or a grand speech, because I had learned that families like mine do not bend for spectacle. They bend when a new gravity settles in the room and every object quietly remembers where it actually belongs. So I left the file sitting in their pockets and purses where it would keep living long after the dishes were done, and I told my mother, gently but without any apology left in the syllables, that words like responsible and deserving carry weight only when they are attached to actions that hold up a roof through winter. And my father, looking at the highlighted lines on his printout, started to say that he had not understood the urgency in spring, that he would have handled it if he had known, that the bank had been unclear, and I reminded him that the county had been very clear in letters with red bands and easy verbs. Emily reached for her phone the way someone reaches for a life vest, scrolled through the PDF that did not care about tone or birth order, and when she tried to slide into that familiar pitying smile, the muscles in her face betrayed her. because a new notification had popped up over the document and the color drained from her neck in a way I would have missed if I had not spent years observing the small weather systems across her expressions, and I watched as she thumbed the screen and tucked the phone under the table, whispering that this was not the time, not tonight, not during Thanksgiving, which would have sounded noble if I had not already suspected what was hiding behind her urgency. I poured myself a little more wine with a steadiness that made my hand feel like it belonged to someone wiser and far less tired, raised my glass without standing, and said that since we were making toasts it would be fair to celebrate verifiable effort rather than mythology, that I had no interest in humiliating anyone, but had even less interest in being erased by a narrative that used my labor as wallpaper. And then, because I am not a saint and did not want to be one, I added that if Emily wanted the house so urgently she could start by reimbursing the taxes from the last year, at which point the table jolted back to life with the clatter of cutlery and my mother's sharp inhale and my father's muttered request for calm, while Emily, trying to calculate expressions as quickly as she once calculated excuses, pressed her phone to her ear and stood up from the table with an apology shaped like a threat, and as she stepped into the hallway I could hear the first strained syllables of a conversation she absolutely did not want overheard, a conversation that began with the word appraisal spoken too loudly and ended, for now, with the phrase "we cannot keep delaying this" hanging in the air like a storm bell just before it rings. I stood up slowly, not to chase my sister into the hallway like a jealous detective, but to refill the water pitcher with a calm that felt almost theatrical, because staying seated would have made me look cornered while following her would have turned the moment into spectacle, and I wanted neither. Instead, I let the room notice the silence she left behind, the way her chair still held the shape of entitlement, and as I passed by the sideboard, I caught a slice of her voice carrying back through the hallway, low and clipped, telling someone named Mark that the paperwork was ready and the appraiser just needed access sometime next week, that the numbers should clear once the square footage was corrected and the exterior paint was noted as recent, which would have been a charming fantasy if the county database had not already recorded the very dull truth that nothing meaningful had changed except the person paying for stability. It took a second for my father to ask the question that had been crawling toward his throat since the photocopies scraped the cloth, and when he did, he tried to make it sound like simple curiosity rather than fear, asking whether I had misunderstood, whether the payments were really loans rather than gifts, whether I had considered how things might look to outsiders if I kept records as if I were preparing for court, and I told him, with a gentleness that landed harder than anger would have, that I kept records because the last time a notice came in red they both forgot to open it, that I kept records because Emily once promised she would handle the insurance and then left town for a long weekend and returned with a tan and a handful of stories, that I kept records because banks do not accept family lore as currency and tax portals do not care about birth order, and as I said it I realized the part he was really asking me not to say out loud, which was that I kept records because somewhere along the way I stopped trusting any of them with reality. My mother, who had been attacking a crumb near her plate with a napkin as if it were the moral stain that needed lifting, finally asked in a shaky voice where I had found the nerve to talk about money at the table, and I reminded her, without raising my voice, that she had been the one to talk about the house at the table first, that she had chosen a toast as the vehicle for a decree, that if we were going to assign the word responsible to anyone then we owed the truth the courtesy of a seat and a fork, and at that the room shifted in a way you can only feel if you have spent your life calculating weather inside your own living room, because my aunt looked down at the receipts again with a blank expression that read like math. My cousin examined the ceiling as if the paint might crack if he stared long enough, and my father reached for his glass and then put it back without drinking, which he never does. From the hallway came the unmistakable friction of a conversation not going to plan, and I could hear Emily insisting that she had every right to expedite, that the timeline had already stretched, that certain conditions were not her problem. And while she said those sentences that had lubricated her entire life, a new clarity settled over me, not the sick kind that wants to wound, but the clean kind that knows how to protect, because I remembered the morning I sat in the recorder's office in a stiff plastic chair with a folder on my lap and a clerk explaining, without judgment, that if I wanted reimbursement for major expenditures tied to the property, I could file a recorded reimbursement agreement. A plain document that would not transfer ownership, but would ride with the title like a small, stubborn passenger, making sure any transfer had to address what I had poured into the place, and I had done it after the spring panic, submitting the notarized agreement that both my parents had signed on a weekday when Emily was too busy, an agreement that did not broadcast itself to dinner guests, but also did not vanish when people declared wishes over wine. So I set the picture down, took my phone back from the runner, and opened the email thread with the appraiser whose company had reached out after an online request pinged the insurance data. A request that carried Emily's personal email wrapped around our address like ribbon around an old package. And I wrote in language so polite it could have served coffee that access would not be granted by anyone without my written approval because I was the paying insured and the reimbursement lien holder. Of record, that the interior appointment should be canceled until the status of recorded obligations was clarified, that any documents suggesting consent from family members without my signature should be considered incomplete. And I CC'd my parents on the note as if I were simply keeping them in the loop, which was my revenge for the evening, because I have learned that the smallest, quietest locks are the ones that keep opportunists rattling the handle for weeks while telling themselves they are almost inside. When Emily returned to the dining room with a smile arranged tightly over her teeth, she announced that she would prefer to discuss the matter after dessert, that we were letting a good day sour in our mouths, that it was unseemly to drag paperwork into tradition. And I agreed that tradition can be lovely when it is not used like a blindfold, then slid my phone toward her to display the sent email with the subject line temporarily closing access for appraisal scheduling, watched the reflection of the words ripple through her composure, and said in a voice warm enough for company that I completely supported responsible planning, that I adored order, that I simply wanted to ensure no one promised what they could not legally deliver. Which prompted my father to ask, with a strain that made him sound older than he looked, what exactly Emily had been promising, and my mother to whisper a name I did not recognize, and my aunt to say the word escrow even though no one had taught her how to use it, and for a breath the room lived inside a silence so deep it felt like a cathedral, and in that space I wondered, not for the first time, whether I was doing this to save us or to prove that I could. Whether I would regret the precision of my safeguards when the bill came due in loneliness, and then the front door rattled with a polite knock that did not belong to a neighbor or a cousin, a sound that landed like a question we could not avoid any longer. The knock at the door was too careful to be family and too punctual to be neighborly, a measured 3 taps that carried the professional patience of someone who bills by the hour. And while my father half stood as if hospitality might save us from paperwork and my mother pressed her napkin against her knee like a bandage to stop the day from bleeding out, I moved first. Because I had learned that whoever opens the door writes the prologue to whatever comes next, and when I pulled it wide, a man in a windbreaker with a clipboard smile introduced himself as scheduled for a brief interior review connected to insurance updates, a phrase so bland it might have slipped past on any other holiday. Except this one had already stripped the varnish from every polite lie in the house. I did not make a scene, because scenes are Emily's instrument and I had chosen a different one. So I asked for identification with a voice shielded in friendliness and read the laminated card while he explained that a request had been submitted earlier in the week by a listed contact who, by complete coincidence, shared my sister's first name and email format, and, because bureaucracy has a sense of humor that is dry rather than kind, he added that interior access would let them sign off on replacement cost updates connected to a valuation review, and my father, who heard the words valuation the way a man hears weather warnings after too many uninspected storms, invited the poor soul inside out of reflex. At which point I thanked him for coming, stepped forward so my shoulder quietly owned the doorway, and explained that access could not be granted without written approval from the paying insured and recorded reimbursement lien holder of file, both of which were me. And that any attempt to proceed tonight would result not in a festive memory, but in a complaint to his compliance department, a phrase I delivered like a warm cookie, because fairness does not have to be loud to be firm. He blinked, he checked his tablet, he confirmed the name on the portal match, and when he glanced past me toward the dining room and recognized the tableau that every working person learns to read, family mid-holiday, mid-fight, mid-revelation, he took the Mercy exit I offered with a business card and a promise to pause all scheduling until the authorization matrix was corrected, which was my polite way of saying that whatever timetable Emily had been massaging with the platitudes of a born persuader had just hit a gate controlled by someone she was used to ignoring. And as the door clicked shut, the sound traveled like a small verdict back to the table where my mother whispered that this had gone far enough, and my father asked with a ragged caution what exactly a reimbursement lien holder meant for the future of the house. And I told them that it meant debts attached to my effort would not evaporate in the steam rising from casseroles, that it meant any transfer, whether through will, quitclaim, or creative interpretation, would have to address the ledger I had kept while they were busy believing the loudest child. Emily, to her credit, did not feign confusion, perhaps because the performance had grown too heavy for even her surest posture, and instead she folded her arms and said that I was making things ugly, that she had found a buyer who would have been perfect, that the timing mattered because rates were fickle and the market was a moody beast, which landed with the thud of a confession she did not realize she had made, and my father, whose face had been working through equations at the speed of regret, turned to her with a question that would have sounded paternal if it had not been edged with fear, asking whether she had already signed anything, whether earnest money had changed hands, whether she had represented herself as able to deliver the property without complications, and the silence that followed gave us an answer none of us wanted. I did not gloat, because gloating is sugar and I needed protein, so I took out a thin folder I had left on the sideboard hours earlier and placed it in front of my parents with the calm of a nurse setting down a diagnosis. And inside were 3 documents that would matter soon. First, the recorded reimbursement agreement with their signatures and a notary seal that did not care about birth order. Second, an email chain from a listing agent whose smiling headshot suggested optimism as a lifestyle and whose words suggested she had been promised a clean path to market. Third, a draft purchase agreement forwarded to a mysterious partner whose last name did not match ours and whose address belonged to a strip mall office 2 towns over, which would have been just another dubious detail if not for the additional little discovery that the partners LLC shared a registered agent with a lender who had recently advertised cash for deeds solutions to families in transition. A word that sounds gentle until you realize it is chewing on your dining room. My revenge arrived softly, the way a well-oiled hinge swings a heavy door, when I pulled my phone and sent 2 emails that did not use the word threat yet carried consequence like a scent. The first to the smiling agent with a copy of the recorded lien and a straightforward line stating that any marketing, showings, or representations of authority would be considered inducement to breach and reported to the board. The second to the lender attached to the LLC with a concise notice of interest and a request for written confirmation that no encumbrance had been filed under our parcel without the paying insured's consent, and then, because comedy enjoys dark corners, I forwarded both to the family thread that had been born tonight alongside responsible1.pdf, where they settled like coals under the ash, warming the truth even when the room pretended otherwise. My mother tried to summon the moral high ground with a trembling reminder that families should forgive ambitious mistakes and remember that holidays are for peace, and I told her that peace built on erasure is a truce for bullies, that I would happily forgive when the facts stopped hiding under napkins, that love is not a lifelong coupon for cutting in line, and while I said this with a steadiness I had not rehearsed, I felt the lonely draft of the future slide along my arms, because winning sometimes sounds like doors closing, and I am not immune to echoes. Still, I kept my eyes on Emily, who was doing private math about deposits and deadlines and reputations, and whether her familiar magic could charm a way past documents that did not blush. And when the front hallway lit up with the slow wash of headlights against the wall, followed by the thrum of an engine that did not belong to our relatives, I understood that one final player had arrived to collect a promise that could not be delivered without tearing something irreplaceable, which meant that the decision I had avoided for years, the choice between keeping a family and keeping myself, had just stepped onto our porch and rang the bell a second time. The headlights washed across the hallway again with the patient confidence of someone who expects a door to open, because it always has. And when I reached the foyer before anyone else, I found a man whose winter coat was a little too thin for the job, standing on the mat with an envelope tucked inside a clipboard, and a voice that tried for neutral and landed on weary, explaining that he needed to deliver documents related to a pending purchase option and a preliminary possession agreement, contingent on timely access, which sounded like an attempt to turn our dining room into a staging area for a handoff that would have made Emily's week and wrecked mine. So I thanked him for braving the cold, accepted the envelope without inviting him past the threshold, signed the tiny electronic slab, because working people deserve efficiency even when they are ferrying bad ideas, and closed the door softly enough to show that this was not about humiliation. This was about finality. I took the clipboard to the table like a cake no one wanted and slid out the forms, noticing the efficient phrases that try to make irreversible things feel gentle, subject to market conditions, mutually agreeable access, no warranties express or implied, and the space where Emily had already initialed with the kind of flourish that suggests practice. And while my father murmured her name once like an apology and once like a warning, my mother began to stitch together a speech about family, opportunity, and letting go, which would have worked on me a few years ago when I still believed that patience could soften steel. But tonight I kept my mouth still until I saw the clause that mattered. A line that tried to skip over encumbrances by waving at them rather than reading them, and then I looked up and said, in a voice that chose grace over volume, that the documents assumed a clean path to title where none existed, that the reimbursement agreement recorded after the spring debacle would travel with any transfer until addressed in full, that the insurance and tax obligations already ran through my accounts and were not available for hijacking by enthusiasm or nostalgia, and that any attempt to grant access or represent authority without my written approval would sink the transaction, not because I was vindictive, but because the math would not close. Emily told me to stop acting like a landlord at Thanksgiving, told me that buyers did not wait forever and neither did reputations, told me that I was making everything ugly because I craved control, and I could have argued, could have poured gasoline on the moment, could have laughed at the irony of being called controlling by the person who had spent the week scheduling strangers to walk through our lives, yet instead I reached into my bag and pulled out the thin blue folder I had not expected to need until winter and set it in front of my parents with the slow relief of someone finally using the parachute she packed herself, because inside were 3 pages that altered the geometry of the room. A simple right of first refusal agreement they had signed at the recorder's office when the spring panic was still hot and the clerk had offered them water. An election notice exercising that right sent to a title company that morning after the appraisal email first pinged my phone. And a receipt for a small earnest money deposit that had already opened a placeholder escrow in my name, which meant that the path was now mine to walk or decline, that no one could sprint past me with a smile and a key. My father ran a thumb over the signatures like he was checking for forgery, even though he had stood beside a notary after lunch on a weekday and shaken my hand in gratitude, because he had thought the document would never matter. And my mother asked in a voice that kept trying to steady itself whether I was really prepared to buy them out, whether I understood what it meant to carry a house alone, whether the point of family was not to share burdens rather than hoard them, and I told her that I was not hoarding anything, that I had been sharing a burden for years with people who pretended it weighed nothing, that buying them out was not greed, but a boundary drawn after too many holidays spent pretending that love was the same thing as surrender. And when she whispered that I was breaking her heart, I answered as kindly as I could that her heart had survived much worse than honesty and would survive this if she let it, and that I could live with being the villain in a bedtime story if it meant the roof stayed where roofs belong. Emily leaned in with the ferocity of someone watching her scaffolding creak, and she tried a new angle that had worked on bosses and old boyfriends, and at least one judge, arguing that the right of first refusal had been explained to her as a formality during the spring chaos, that she had never been told it could be used to block a sale to a better-suited owner, that I was exploiting fine print to win a family argument. which might have played if the dining room had not already seen the receipts and if the envelope on the table had not carried her initials beside dates that matched the appraiser's polite knock. So I did not bother convincing her with philosophy. I simply opened my phone, forwarded the election notice and escrow number to the agent, and the lender, already warming my inbox, added a sentence that any further contact should route through the title officer assigned to my file and CC my parents, because revenge, at its cleanest, is not a dagger but a timestamp that changes other people's calendars. The room breathed in ragged gasps, and for a long minute no one spoke, and in that minute I felt both the lift of safety and the pinch of future loneliness, because decisions that save you do not always seat you at crowded tables, and I looked at my father, who had taught me as a child to balance checkbooks on the back of envelopes and had later forgotten that skill when the world got louder, and I told him quietly, without triumph, that if he wanted me to step back I would, that if he believed Emily could carry tax cycles and insurance audits and winter repairs with the same grace she wielded at a microphone, I would rescind the election and let him try yet another narrative. And he surprised everyone by folding the blue folder closed with hands that had finally stopped shaking and saying, in the kind of voice men reserve for when they have run out of angles, that he was tired of stories and ready for facts, that the person who kept the heat on should decide where the thermostat lived, that the House would stay or go according to whoever could look the county in the eye in March, which sounded comically unpoetic and yet was the truest benediction he had ever offered. We finished dessert like people learning how to chew again, and when the headlights vanished and the wind picked up and the tablecloth stopped its small trembling, Emily gathered her purse with movements that made no noise and said that she would speak to her contacts in the morning, that perhaps there had been misunderstandings, that she hoped we would all remember what holidays are for. And I wished her a gentle night because cruelty would have been too easy, and after the dishes were stacked and the leftovers were tucked and the house finally exhaled, I stood alone in the hallway and listened to the slow settling of beams that had outlived several versions of us, and I admitted to the old paint and the barely warm vents and the framed school photos that still guarded the stairs, that I did not know whether I had saved something worth keeping or merely proved that I could. That maybe responsible is just another word for stubborn when you speak it in the dark, and that the right answer might not be a deed or a signature, but the question I would keep asking every winter from now on, whether a home is a place you win or a place you make every month, one quiet receipt at a time.